She captured a human thinking he'd beg, break, or die. But humans don't kneel. We adapt. We endure. We fight. He didn't just survive. He made her question everything she believed. Because you can bind the hands, but not the heart. Not the will. This isn't just a story about chains. It's about what makes us human, and why that terrifies them. If you're proud to be human, and love stories where we don't just survive, we inspire, hit subscribe. Humanity has stories to tell. The sky above Veron Zet churned like liquid fire, thick with crimson clouds swirling across a dying sun. The planet groaned beneath its own weight, its surface jagged and dry, etched with canyons that looked like scars carved by angry gods. Wind screamed through the crevices, dragging fine red dust that scoured anything foolish enough to resist. Jon Ray had no choice but to resist. His ship had slammed into the desert floor like a thrown dagger. The hull was shredded, smoke still curling from what remained of its frame. Half buried in sand and heat, it looked more like a tomb than a vessel now. Jon lay sprawled in the wreckage, lips cracked, vision blurry. Blood trickled down his temple, warm against skin already baking under Veron Zet's merciless light. He coughed, copper and dust, and tried to move. Pain flared instantly, sharp and urgent, lighting up every nerve. Emergency beacon, he muttered, patting the side of his flight vest. Crushed. Of course. A shadow fell across him. He looked up, squinting against the harsh red light, and froze. Towering above him stood a figure, tall, statuesque, in armor that looked grown rather than forged. Her skin was a deep cerulean blue, patterned with scars like ancient tribal ink. Her eyes glowed gold in the half-light, feral and focused. A long spear rested casually in her hand. Another invader, she said in a voice like gravel sliding over stone. Then, without ceremony, she flipped him over and drove his face into the sand. Wah, he gasped, but before he could protest, rough vine rope bit into his wrists. The bindings were cruel, barbed with tiny hooks that made struggling a painful gamble. The fleet will come, Jon managed through gritted teeth. They'll find me. Her response was a short, humorless laugh. Let them come. The hunter drone's hunger for more wreckage. She hauled him to his feet like he weighed nothing. Jon stumbled, half-dragged, already cataloging options. Escape? Unlikely. Fight? Laughable. Survive? Maybe if he played smart. You know, he said, catching his breath as they began moving across the wasteland, there are easier ways to make friends than shooting down ships. Another tug of the rope. The barbs bit deeper. Save your breath, soft skin. You'll need it. The desert seemed endless, a cruel expanse of rock and ruin. Every step was a negotiation with pain. The woman, she hadn't given a name, walked with practiced ease, her spear swaying lazily in one hand, her eyes never still. A predator's gaze. Jon, for his part, limped along and tried not to die. Hours passed, maybe more. Time dissolved in heat and silence, broken only by the howl of wind and the occasional barked command. When they finally stopped near a cliff overhang, she checked a series of traps, bone and rope contraptions meant for creatures Jon didn't want to meet. She turned her back. Jon moved. His fingers, bloodied from the bonds, had been working the knots. Not to escape. Not yet. Just enough slack. A few paces away, he spotted a cactus, squat, bulbous, and bristling with needles. With a glance to ensure she wasn't looking, he twisted, knelt awkwardly, and rolled it beneath the stone she'd be sitting on. She returned, settled onto the rock, and launched into the air with a yelp that cracked the silence in two. Who dares sting the rear of Turon of Zera? Jon raised an innocent eyebrow. Local love cactus. Legend says it brings luck. Her eyes could have burned holes through steel. Before she could kill him for it, a shadow fell over them. Both looked up. A creature, winged, snake-like, its barbed tail glistening, circled overhead. Turon tensed. Spike tail, she whispered. Don't move. It dove. Jon moved. Still bound, he threw himself at Turon, knocking her clear just as the creature's tail struck where she'd been. The barbed spike, embedded in stone, stuck. The beast shrieked, wings thrashing. Turon was already up, hurling her spear with deadly precision. The creature fell, impaled, still twitching. Silence. Then Jon coughed. So, still enemies, or do I get a medal? Maybe a cup of something that isn't sand. Taran stared at him for a long beat. Something had shifted, a fracture in the ice. She said nothing, but she didn't check his bonds again. The canyons deepened as the sun fell. Crimson turned to burnt orange. The wind carried colder teeth now. Storm season, Taran muttered, glancing skyward. We need shelter. And then what? You torture me for intel? Jon asked, only half joking. She didn't answer right away. My clan will decide. I'm bound to bring you in alive. Why alive? Doesn't seem like your style. Her jaw twitched. Because I need to know why you're here. Why your kind keeps coming, even when warned. A shout echoed across the canyon. Taran pushed Jon behind a boulder, eyes scanning. A group of warriors, blue-skinned, like her, but in different armor, marched below. She tensed. My brother. He leads the kill squad. Jon blinked. Kill squad? Seriously? Our law is clear. Outsiders die on sight. I didn't follow that law. Why not? She hesitated. Because corpses don't answer questions. They crouched there, breathless, until the squad passed. But it was clear they were being tracked. We need to move, she whispered. There's a cave system east of here. We lose them in the dark. The wind howled louder, carrying with it sand that stung skin and turned the air into fire. Jon stumbled after her, ropes biting, but with every step, he watched her. This warrior who hadn't killed him, this stranger whose touch could both bind and protect. He didn't know what he was to her yet, but he knew this. She hadn't called him soft skin since the spiked tail, and that had to mean something. As they hurried east along the canyon floor, the wind began to shift. Taran stopped suddenly, eyes narrowing at the sky. The clouds above twisted in angry spirals, and the air took on a sharp, metallic taste. Storm's coming, she said grimly. A big one. Jon glanced up, the light already dimming, a wall of red dust forming on the horizon like the edge of a rising tide. Then she grabbed his arm. We run. Now. The storm came on fast. A boiling wall of crimson dust swallowed the horizon, moving like a living thing. Jon barely had time to shield his eyes before it hit. Wind screamed, tearing at his clothes, grinding grit into every cut and bruise. Taran didn't hesitate. She grabbed his arm, and they ran. The cave appeared like a slit in the canyon wall, narrow, jagged, half hidden by sand-swept stone. She shoved him inside and followed, sliding a slab of rock into the opening just as the sandstorm slammed into the canyon. Inside was darkness, cold and close. The sound outside became a distant roar, like the growl of some sleeping beast. Jon collapsed to the floor, gasping, sweat and blood mixing on his skin. Taran stood at the entrance, breathing hard, her armor coated in fine dust. Her eyes glowed in the dim, gold and alien. That storm will strip flesh, she said. We'll wait it out here. And then... She turned toward him. Then I take you to the stronghold. Unless something eats us first. You're a real optimist, you know that? She didn't smile, but there was a flicker in her expression, a twitch of something unspoken. The cave stretched deeper. Rough walls, ancient mineral veins shimmering faintly. Fungi clung to stone in pale clusters, casting a ghost light. Come, Taran said. Further in. It's warmer near the spring. Jon followed, boots scraping. The farther they went, the more the air shifted, from biting dry to cool and damp. A faint sound echoed ahead, dripping water. They entered a chamber where a shallow pool shimmered. The ceiling was low, heavy with stalactites. It felt almost sacred. Taran knelt and filled her canteen. She tossed him a glance. Drink, not poisoned. You know me so well already. He cupped water to his lips. It was cool, faintly metallic but clean. He drank deeply. She sat across from him, removing the outer layer of her armor. Beneath it, her underclothing clung to her like a second skin, damp with sweat. Her body was coiled strength, scarred, hardened, but undeniably feminine. Jon looked away quickly. You're injured, she said. Nothing that isn't already used to hurting. Let me see. She didn't wait. She moved closer, crouching beside him, her fingers on his arm. She rolled up his sleeve, revealing raw abrasions where the vine ropes had cut deep. Her touch was clinical at first. She opened a small pouch, dipped her fingers into a thick, greenish salve, and pressed it gently into the wounds. Jon sucked in a breath, not from the pain, from her closeness. The scent of her hit him, wild and unfamiliar. Heat, leather, ozone. Her hand lingered a moment longer than necessary. She looked up. Their eyes met. "Why did you save me?" she asked, voice barely a whisper. "When? The spiked tail? Seemed rude not to. You risked yourself. So who did you when you didn't kill me? Maybe we're both bad at being enemies." She stared at him, unreadable. Then she sat back, knees bent beneath her, arms resting on her thighs. Her hair had come loose from its tie, thick dark strands curling slightly from sweat. She looked almost human in that moment. "When I was young," she said slowly, "I believed all off-worlders were monsters. Soft things with cold eyes and greedy hands. That's what we were taught. And now—" She didn't answer. Instead, she reached out again, this time to his face. Her thumb brushed a smear of blood from his cheek, slow, deliberate. Jon's breath caught. "Do all prisoners get this level of care?" he murmured. "Only the dangerous ones," she said. Her voice was different now, low and almost teasing. Almost. The air shifted again. He could feel it. She didn't move away. Jon's heart thudded. The pulse in his neck was loud. They were so close. Inches. Her hand dropped his chest, not forceful but steady. She could have shoved him, punched him, dragged him back into chains. She didn't. "You're warm," she said, almost to herself. "Not as warm as you." Her hand stayed. Heat built between them, not just body heat. Something electric, heavy. "If I wanted to, I could crush your throat," she murmured. "If you wanted to, you would have already." Their eyes locked. Then her hand slid from his chest, down, slowly tracing the edge of his ribs. Her nails, short but sharp, dragged lightly over his shirt, not cutting, just enough pressure to ignite every nerve beneath. He didn't move, didn't breathe. The moment balanced on a blade. Her fingers stopped at his hip. She leaned in. "Do not mistake mercy for weakness," she whispered into his ear. Her breath was hot against his skin. "Wouldn't dream of it," he said, husky. She lingered a heartbeat longer, long enough for him to feel the heat of her mouth near his. Then she pulled away, stood, and turned toward the water. Jon let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. His skin felt too tight. His heart was a drum. She didn't look back. "Sleep," she said. "The storm will last hours. We'll need strength." Jon leaned back against the cave wall, trying to calm the fire her touch had left behind. He didn't know what had just happened, but he knew this. If she touched him again, truly touched him, there'd be no pretending it was just survival. And he wasn't sure he'd stop her. He closed his eyes. Outside, the storm screamed. Inside, his thoughts were louder. And Taran was watching him in the dark. Jon awoke to silence. Not the peaceful kind, the kind that pressed against the ears, tense with held breath. Taran sat by the cave wall, fully armored again, her spear across her lap. Her eyes were fixed on the shadows near the cave's mouth. Watching, he sat up slowly. Muscles ached, wrists throbbed, but something else gnawed at him. A question he hadn't asked last night. "Do they know where we are?" he asked quietly. She didn't look at him. "They're hunting. Here is not one to lose his prey." There was a weight in her tone now. Personal, not just tactical. Jon stood, brushing off grit. "Your brother. He seems like a warm and fuzzy kind of guy." Taran didn't smile. "Kier believes power is earned through conquest. His vision is absolute. Our people follow strength. That makes him dangerous." She finally turned to look at him. "I broke clan law by sparing you. He'll use that." Jon moved closer, voice lower. "Then maybe we don't let him frame the story." Taran tilted her head. "What are you suggesting?" But before Jon could answer, both of them froze. A voice echoed down the stone tunnel. "Taran, sister." Taran stood, body stiff as carved obsidian. Kier's voice was deceptively calm. "You dishonor us by hiding. Bring the off-worlder. Let us settle this as family." Jon whispered, I'm guessing that doesn't mean hugs. Turan motioned sharply. This way. There's another exit. They moved quickly through the narrow passages, guided only by the dim glow of cave fungi. Behind them, footsteps. Echoes. Kier's voice again, fainter, but closer. You always were soft, Turan. Weak like mother. Always listening instead of leading. That stopped her cold. Jon watched her face change. Not anger. Not fear. Guilt. She turned without a word and kept walking. They emerged into a high tunnel with a split. One led deeper underground, the other upward. Turan paused, gaze flicking between them. Jon touched her shoulder. Which way gets us out? Up, she said, but exposes us. Better than being cornered. They climbed. Stone gave way to sun-blasted light. They shielded their eyes as they emerged onto a ridge high above the canyon. The storm had passed, leaving behind a shattered sky and the scorched scent of ozone. But they weren't alone. Kier stood near the cliff's edge, flanked by two warriors. He wore ceremonial armor, obsidian black, etched with clan glyphs. His eyes, the same amber as Turan's, burned brighter than the sun. Turan, he said, still clinging to your pet. She stepped in front of Jon, spear at the ready. I came for answers, not blood, she said. You forced my hand. Kier raised an eyebrow. You broke sacred law, spared an invader. What excuse do you offer? I offer the truth, she snapped. You attacked his ship without provocation. He smiled. Because I knew they would come. And they did. Jon stepped forward. You wanted this. Va. Kier didn't deny it. Our people grow soft in peace. Fear binds them more than any oath. Give them an enemy, and they will beg me to lead. Turan stared. You would sacrifice innocence. Our own for glory? No, Kier said. I would sacrifice them for survival. You mistake comfort for strength. Jon felt the air shift again. A storm of a different kind. You used ancient tech to bring us down, Jon said. The drones, they're not yours. Who gave them to you? Kier's smile was thin. There are others who share our vision, who see the galaxy as it is, not how dreamers wish it to be. Turan stepped forward, eyes blazing. You allied with the Vextal. Not allied, Kier corrected. Negotiated. They offer us tools. We offer them territory. A small price. Jon's stomach turned. You're selling out your people. I'm saving them, Kier said. From weakness. From extinction. From idealists like you. Then his hand went up. The two warriors raised their weapons. Turan's spear spun in a blur, knocking one back, deflecting a shot from the second. Jon ducked, grabbed a loose stone, and hurled it, hitting the warrior square in the head. Chaos. Dust. Shouts. Kier lunged at Turan, blade drawn. They clashed, metal ringing against hardened bone, fury and fire meeting in a storm of siblings. Jon tried to reach her, but the terrain tilted beneath him. He slipped, tumbling down the slope as the ridge crumbled. He hit hard, vision spinning. Above, Turan and Kier were silhouettes against the sky. She fought like a storm, but Kier matched her, brute force and ruthless precision. And then a cry. Turan staggered. Jon pushed himself up, blood in his mouth. Kier had her by the throat, blade poised. I warned you, he hissed. Then Jon charged. No weapons. No plan. Just rage. He slammed into Kier, the three of them toppling. The blade skittered away. Turan gasped, rolled aside. Kier rose, eyes wild. You don't belong here, he snarled. Funny, Jon said. Neither do you. Then he punched him. Once. Twice. Kier reeled, and Turan's spear struck from behind. He fell. Not dead, but broken. Turan stood over him, chest heaving. You betrayed your blood, she said. You're no leader. Kier spat. They will follow me still. They crave war. Then let them hear the truth, Jon said. All of it. Turan looked to him, then nodded. She turned to the canyon and fired a flare. A signal. A challenge. Let the clans come. Let the lies burn. And maybe, just maybe, something better could rise from the ash. The flare burned a trail of light across the sky, a crimson slash against Veronzet's eternal dusk. It lingered above the canyons like a challenge, daring the truth to come meet them. Jon stood beside Turan as the echo of its launch faded. He could feel the tension coiling between them, not just from the fight with Kier, but from what came next. This was no longer about survival. It was about what they stood for, and what they'd stand against. Taran's jaw was tight, her voice low. The clans will come, some to kill us, some to listen. Jon nodded. We just need to get to that meeting place you mentioned. The neutral ground. She pointed toward the east, a jagged path cutting through rock toward a series of natural bridges. The old crossing. It leads to the council's chambers. Even Kier wouldn't dare spill blood there. If he follows the rules. Taran gave him a look. He won't, but the law still matters to some. They moved fast. The terrain was brutal. Slabs of stone, loose scree, narrow ledges. Every step was a risk. Behind them, dust trails rose. Others were coming. Whether friend or foe, they couldn't tell. As they approached the first bridge, Jon paused. It was ancient, a natural stone arc suspended over a chasm so deep it swallowed sound. Whether by time, it looked too thin to hold weight. You sure this is safe? It stood for millennia, Taran said. It will hold, unless too many cross at once. Jon glanced down again. That's very comforting. She started across, steps sure and light. He followed, careful, feeling the bridge subtly shift beneath them. Halfway across, the wind rose, and with it, voices. From both ends of the bridge, figures emerged. On the far side, warriors from Taran's clan, their armor etched with old glyphs, council guards. But behind them, more shadows. And among them, unmistakable, Kier, flanked by loyalists. Eyes burning, weapon drawn. Jon swore. He got ahead of us. Taran didn't stop. She walked forward, slow but certain. When she reached the center of the bridge, she raised her spear. Kier, she called. Stand down. We seek the council. You know this ground is sacred. Kier stepped forward, cloak whipping in the wind. You seek protection. You will find none. You brought outsiders to poison our laws. I bring justice. This is not justice, she said. This is ambition. Jon moved to her side. This is madness. Kier sneered. Still hiding behind your human. Sister, how far you've fallen. More warriors moved onto the bridge from both sides. The stone groaned. Taran whispered. Too many. It won't hold. Jon looked around, calculating. They were trapped in the middle. He turned to Taran. We need to break through. Pick one side and run. Before she could answer, Kier raised his hand. A signal, and chaos erupted. Screams, the hiss of blasters, the clang of metal. Jon ducked as a spear sliced past his head. Taran spun, knocking an attacker aside with the haft of her weapon. Her movements were fluid, deadly. Jon grabbed a fallen Zera blade and joined her, parrying a strike just in time. The bridge shifted beneath them, rocked by violence. Cracks spiderwebbed through the stone. Kier fought his way toward them, eyes locked on Taran. Jon could see the obsession in his face. This wasn't just conquest. It was personal. More warriors surged forward. The weight was too much. A section of the bridge behind them crumbled, sending fighters screaming into the abyss. Go, Taran shouted, shoving Jon toward the far end. You can still make it. He didn't move. Taran, I'll hold them. Run. But he didn't run. He turned and charged toward her instead. She was surrounded, 3 warriors hemming her in. She fought like fire, but she was slowing, bleeding. Jon slammed into one from behind, driving him over the edge, grabbed another by the arm, and wrenched him back. Taran took the opening and drove her spear into the third. Then Kier was there. He lashed out, catching Jon across the ribs with the blunt end of his weapon. Jon stumbled but didn't fall. Kier raised his blade, and Taran tackled him. They rolled, locked in fury. She screamed something in Zuran. Jon didn't understand the words, but he felt them. Felt the grief, the betrayal. The bridge groaned again. Another fracture split the stone. Jon grabbed Taran's arm and yanked her toward the edge. We have to go. Now. She hesitated, staring at Kier, bloody and struggling to rise. Now, Jon shouted. They ran, leapt the last crack just as the bridge collapsed behind them. A thunderous roar as centuries of stone gave way. The canyon swallowed the sound. Dust and silence. They collapsed on solid ground. Alive, just barely. Taran sat up slowly, blood on her lips. Her eyes were wild. "You came back," she said. Jon coughed, wincing. "Yeah, I'm a terrible prisoner. Disobedient. Sentimental. Bad habit." She stared at him, then pulled him into a kiss. It wasn't gentle. It was fire and fury and gratitude and grief. A tangle of emotion too big to hold inside. Her hands found his jaw, pulled him closer. His arms wrapped around her, anchoring them both. When they parted, she rested her forehead against his. "I would have died," she whispered. "You would have saved me first." They sat there, pressed together on the edge of the broken bridge, breath tangled. Below them, the wind howled through the chasm. Above, distant drums echoed. The council had heard the flare. And ahead came judgment. The air in the canyon was still thick with dust when they found the hidden alcove. Taran led the way with a limp, favoring her right leg, blood soaking through a gash at her thigh. Jon followed close behind, his own ribs aching from the strike Kier had landed. Neither spoke. They needed somewhere safe, somewhere quiet. The cave they found was small, barely more than a hollow in the rock, but dry and deep enough to mask their presence from scouts above. As soon as they were inside, Jon collapsed against the wall with a long exhale. Taran dropped her spear and leaned back, head tilted toward the ceiling, eyes closed. Dust clung to her skin in places sweat hadn't washed clean. She looked carved from the stone itself, a warrior brought low by exhaustion, but never truly broken. Jon reached into his pouch and pulled the last of the clean gauze Mia had given him before the crash. "Let me see your leg," he said, voice soft. Taran looked at him for a long moment, then nodded. No words, just trust. She shifted, drawing her injured leg toward him. The fabric of her pants had torn at the thigh. Jon worked carefully, cutting a wider opening with his knife. His fingers brushed against her skin, hot, firm, tense with pain. "You should have let me face him alone," she murmured. "I don't leave people behind," Jon said. "Especially not you." She watched him work, the way his brow furrowed, the way his hands moved. Not clumsy, not afraid, focused, gentle, different from every male she'd ever fought beside or fought against. "You're not like the others," she said, almost to herself. He glanced up. Other humans? Other warriors. He tied off the bandage and looked at her, really looked. "You're not like the others either." The silence stretched. Outside, the wind had stilled. Inside, their breath filled the air. Jon's fingers were still resting lightly on her thigh. He didn't move them. Neither did she. "You kissed me," he said quietly. "You saved me. Was that thanks?" Her gaze didn't waver. "It was instinct." He nodded slowly. "This is a terrible place for instincts." She shifted, just slightly, enough to bring her face closer to his. "Then maybe," she said, "we stop thinking for one moment." Their lips met again, slower this time. Not a clash of adrenaline, but a deep, measured pull, like gravity finding its anchor. Taran's hand moved to his jaw, rough fingers tracing the line of his cheek. Jon's arms went around her waist, pulling her closer. Armor clinked softly as it was shed in pieces. Breath hitched. Hands explored, curious, reverent, hungry, but never hurried. She pressed him down against the cave floor, straddling his hips, her golden eyes burning with something far older than war. "You're still my prisoner," she whispered, her voice rough with desire. "Then this is the best damn cell I've ever been in," he murmured, lips brushing her collarbone. Their movements blurred into heat and rhythm, into skin and friction, into sighs swallowed by each other's mouths. Not a battlefield, not a power struggle, just two survivors sharing what little warmth the universe allowed. Later, they lay tangled on the soft layer of moss near the pool's edge, wrapped in the warmth of shared breath. Jon's hand traced idle patterns on her bare shoulder. "What happens now?" Taran exhaled slowly. "Now we climb. The council chamber lies ahead. They'll want answers. So will the rest of the clan. And if they don't like what we have to say, then I hope they attack one at a time," she said dryly, but there was no humor in it. Jon turned to face her. "I meant what I said. I'm not leaving you." She touched his face, thumb grazing his lip. You came back for me when you could have run. You kissed me when you didn't have to. For a long moment, they said nothing more. Then she rose, gathering her armor piece by piece. Get some rest. We move at first light. Jon watched her. The way her body moved now, not just with strength but with something else. With trust. With choice. He knew the next day might kill them both. But tonight, in this narrow fold of safety carved between storms and stone, he let himself believe in something more. And she, just once, allowed herself to want it. The entrance to the Zera stronghold rose before them like the jaw of some ancient beast. Carved into the canyon wall, it was a fusion of nature and design. Vast pillars of stone wrapped in vines, banners fluttering in the hot wind. Taran stood before it in silence, her face unreadable. Jon, still limping slightly, took her hand. You sure they'll listen? No, she said, but we're going to speak anyway. Mia and Carter had arrived earlier, guided by sympathetic scouts who had found their flare. Mia was busy securing the holographic recorder Jon had carried since the crash, the one that, miraculously, had survived the fight and recorded Kier's confession. Audio's clean, she said. Visuals grainy, but you can hear everything he said. If this council has even one honest elder, they'll have to act. Jon nodded, heart pounding. This wasn't just about surviving anymore. It was about exposing a lie, changing a future. Inside, the council chamber felt more like a temple than a courtroom. A ring of thrones encircled a central stone floor, each occupied by an elder whose skin bore the softening hue of age, but whose eyes still burned sharp. Taran stepped into the center, chin high. By the old laws, she declared, voice echoing, I invoke right of council. A silence passed like a shadow. Then one of the elders, a tall figure with deep blue skin faded almost to silver, nodded slowly. Daughter of Varric, you may speak, but speak carefully. You return from exile with outsiders at your side and blood on your hands. Taran bowed her head respectfully. Then she straightened and spoke with calm fire. I bring truth, not just for me, for all of us. She gestured to Mia, who activated the device. The council chamber filled with Kier's voice, arrogant, sharp, undeniable. Our people grow soft in peace. Fear binds them more than any oath. Give them an enemy, and they will beg me to lead. Murmurs rippled through the council. One of the elders slammed his staff against the floor. That voice was Kier's. He admitted everything, Taran said. He struck down a peace mission, then blamed me for betrayal when I refused to play along. Another elder leaned forward. Why would he do this? Jon stepped up beside her. Because war creates leaders. He wanted your people scared, angry, united under him. A third elder, smaller, shrewder, narrowed her eyes. You speak boldly, off-worlder, as if you know our ways. I don't, Jon said, but I know ambition, and I know the look of someone who'd burn everything down just to sit on the ashes. Silence. Then another voice, sharp and hostile, rose from the far side of the chamber. He lies. A Zera warrior stepped forward. Drax, one of Kier's last loyalists. His eyes were wild, jaw clenched. This is a trick, fabricated by their machines. Elder Vorak, the silver-skinned one, turned toward him. You deny Kier's voice? I deny this performance. He was loyal. He died protecting us from these invaders. Taran's voice cut across the tension. He died trying to kill me. On sacred ground. After admitting everything. Drax sneered. Because you corrupted him. With this, he pointed to Jon, this parasite who whispers into your ear like a lover. Jon stepped forward. I didn't whisper. I stayed. I fought beside her. I bled for her people. If that makes me your enemy, then maybe your laws are as broken as your loyalty. Gasps and murmurs. The words had weight. Vorak raised a hand for silence. We have heard both sides, he said, but more than words are needed. Do you have anything else? Mia stepped forward. We recovered fragments of the hunter drone that shot us down. It carries Zera code, but the command signature was artificial. Inserted from a foreign source. She handed over a device. We believe Kier made a deal with the Vextal. That name landed like a bomb. More shouts. One elder stood in rage. Trafficking with the Vextal is heresy. Vorik's voice thundered. Enough. He stood. Let be known. The council will recess and examine the evidence. If what you say is true, it will change everything. He looked at Turon. You're your father's daughter, and perhaps his legacy is not yet ash. The council exited, leaving the chamber cold with tension. Turon let out a breath that trembled just slightly. Jon touched her arm. That went well. She gave him a look. No one tried to kill us. I call that a miracle. Behind them, Drax lingered, his eyes filled with venom. This isn't over. Turon stared him down. No, it's just beginning. The council chamber was empty now, its echoes still carrying the weight of judgment not yet passed. Outside, the sky had dimmed. Clouds the color of bruised blood rolled in from the eastern horizon. Unnatural, even for Veronzet. Turon stood beside Jon and Mia at the parapet overlooking the canyon, her gaze distant. Jon could feel the shift in her. Not fear, something colder. She had sensed it before anyone else. Something's coming, she murmured. Mia, checking the portable scanner she had patched together again, looked up sharply. I'm picking up elevated electromagnetic interference. Spiking hard. That's not weather. Lieutenant Carter appeared from the courtyard, hand pressed against his side. He had been resting since the council hearing, but hadn't strayed far. The sky looks wrong, he muttered. Remind me of low-orbit bombardment. Jon's stomach dropped. Suddenly, a sound tore through the sky. A howl. Not of wind, but of engines far beyond Zera design. The clouds parted like skin beneath a blade, and the Vextal descended. 3 vessels, sleek, dark, insectal, pierced the heavens and hovered above the stronghold. They didn't wait. Twin lances of energy lashed out from their bellies, carving trenches through the canyon floor. Stone exploded. Screams rose. They're attacking, someone shouted. Turon didn't hesitate. To arms, she cried, voice ringing across the fortress. Guards scrambled. Warriors poured from barracks. But even as the Zera readied defenses, the air shimmered, and black-armored figures materialized near the gates, like shadows peeled from the walls. Vextal infantry. Jon grabbed Mia and ducked behind a stone archway as plasma fire erupted. This wasn't a raid, Mia gasped. This is an incursion. Jon turned to Carter. What are we looking at? Strike force. Surgical. They're not here to conquer. They're here to eliminate. Eliminate what? Carter's face was grim. Loose ends. Turon rejoined them, her spear stained already. They're targeting the elders. They want the truth buried with us. Jon drew a salvaged Zera blade. Then we don't let them. The stronghold became a war zone. The Zera fought with brutal elegance, leaping from stone balconies, ambushing from behind carved pillars, striking with spears, crackling with energy. But the Vextal were faster, colder, machines in flesh. Jon fought beside Turon, every step shadowing hers. He had never been trained like she was, but he was quick, and anger gave his strikes weight. At the central plaza, Vorik and 3 other elders were surrounded. Drax, wounded but still moving, stood near them, defending the council with surprising ferocity. Mia ducked behind a broken column, pulling wires from her scanner. I can overload the comm tower's backup grid, she said. Blind their orbit to ground, targeting for a few minutes. Do it, Carter said. That's all we need. Turon nodded. Jon and I will hold the line. He touched her shoulder. You trust me that much? She gave him a thin smile. I trusted you with my life before I trusted you with my body. Seems consistent. He grinned despite the chaos. You have a gift for romantic timing. Then they moved. The battle at the gates was a blur of flame and steel. Jon fought like a man with nothing to lose. Turon was wind and lightning beside him. A Vextal commander, taller than the rest, with armor that shimmered like wet oil, stepped into their path. Earthling, it hissed in perfect basic. You do not belong. Jon stepped forward. Neither do you. They clashed. The Vextal moved with terrifying speed, its blades like liquid shadow. But Turon met it blow for blow, her spear sparking as it met alien metal. Jon waited, then struck low, sweeping the creature's legs. It faltered, and Taran's spear drove into its neck joint with a crunch of bone and circuitry. It collapsed, twitching. Mia's voice crackled over Jon's comm. Signal jammed. 5 minutes max. Carter responded. That's enough. Fire team to the North Tower. Draw them in. And then the Vextal made their mistake. They regrouped near the council chamber, focusing their assault on the elders. But the Zero were ready. Drax, bloodied and breathing hard, flanked the enemy with a team of younger warriors. Taran led a charge from the front. Jon and Carter cut off retreat. Caught between fury and fire, the Vextal began to fall. As the last of them collapsed, the sky trembled again, but this time it was not more ships. It was retreat. The vessels in orbit turned, streaking away in silence. Whatever purpose they'd come for had failed. Jon stood in the courtyard, chest heaving. Mia emerged from the tower, soot-streaked but smiling. You're welcome. Carter leaned against a wall. We just fought off a Vextal strike team with spears and spare parts. Someone give us a damn medal. Taran walked to the center, where Vorik stood, leaning on his staff. Your people fought with honor, the elder said, looking between her and Jon. And your allies proved they are not the monsters we feared. He turned to the remaining council. The old ways will not save us from what's coming. We need allies. We need understanding. And perhaps we need change. Taran mit Jonskeish. We stand together now, she said. He nodded. No more invaders. No more prisoners. Just survivors. The war had not truly begun, but in that moment, they had won something rarer. A reason to hope. The respite was brief. 3 days after the failed Vextal strike, new signals lit up the edge of Veron Zet's orbit. Larger ships, this time. Carriers. Warforms. The Council's hope for diplomacy turned brittle as the truth became undeniable. The Vextal had not given up. They had escalated. Taran stood at the outer cliffs beside Jon, the wind tugging at her braids. The sky had darkened again, not with storm, but with war. The Council has approved joint action, she said. You, me, Carter, Mia, the strongest of Zera. We lead the strike. Jon looked at her. This is the big one. She nodded. There will be no fallback. If we lose this battle, Veron Zet falls. He reached out and touched her waist, letting the silence speak. They both knew this might be the end. But that night, beneath the twin moons, they didn't speak of endings. They made love with urgency, a hunger shaped by fear and devotion. Every kiss was a promise. Every movement, a declaration. Taran's body trembled not from uncertainty, but from how fiercely she felt him. Every inch, every breath, burned into memory. Jon held her like the world might break apart at any moment, because it might. When they finally lay still, tangled in each other's warmth, Taran whispered, If we die tomorrow, this is what I want to remember. Jon kissed her forehead. Then let's make it worth remembering. The strike plan was madness. Board the Vextal command ship mid-descent. Disable their main relay. Cut off orbital control. Then evacuate before their backup systems re-engaged. Jon piloted the drop ship. Mia rode beside him, fingers dancing across hacked Vextal consoles. 30 seconds to breach, she called. Shield weak points confirmed. In the hold, Carter and the Zero warriors prepped explosives. Taran stood near the door, her armor freshly reforged, her face painted with war marks, crimson lines down her cheeks, symbols of death and defiance. She caught Jon's eye. He gave her a small smile. Last ride. Her gaze softened just slightly. Only if we fail. The ship rocked. Then the door blew open. They dropped straight into hell. The corridors of the Vextal flagship were cold metal and crimson light. Drones poured from the walls like insects, screeching in artificial unison. Jon fought with a stolen blaster in one hand and a blade in the other. Beside him, Taran was a storm. They moved like one. Every time Jon stumbled, her hand was there. Every time she faltered, he stood in her way. They bled. They roared. They survived. They reached the core chamber just as the next wave of reinforcements arrived. Hold them, Carter bellowed. 30 seconds while Mia drops the payload. Taran threw herself into the fray, spear flashing. Jon followed. The moment blurred into violence. Plasma, sparks, blood, shouts. Taran took a hit to the shoulder. Jon caught her before she fell. Still breathing, she gritted. Don't stop. Mia's voice cracked through calms. Done. Fall back. They ran. Through burning corridors, past collapsing bulkheads. Explosions echoed behind them. Jon turned a corner and found a Vextal war form blocking the path. Twice his height, armored in bone metal, holding a cannon that hummed with annihilation. Taran pulled him back just as the first shot screamed past. We won't outrun it, she said. We split. You draw it left. I flank. No, Jon said, grabbing her wrist. We stay together. She hesitated, then kissed him, quick, fierce. Then we burn together. They moved as one. Jon drew its fire. Taran came from behind. Together, they brought it down, Jon's blade in its joint, Taran's spear through its core. The hallway shuddered. A final blast rocked the ship. They burst through the last corridor, just as the dropship descended. Carter hauled them aboard. Get us out of here, Jon shouted. They lifted off. Behind them, the Vextal flagship exploded, a sun blooming in orbit. Back on Veron Zet, the skies were finally quiet. The Vextal ships scattered, retreating, leaderless. In the canyon below, fires still burned, but the Zera banners flew, and the humans still stood. Jon sat on the steps of the council hall, armor scorched, hands shaking. Taran knelt beside him. Her shoulder was bound, her face streaked with soot, but her eyes, gods, her eyes still burned. She took his hand in silence. Carter and Mia stood nearby, watching the stars. No one spoke for a long time. Then Jon leaned his head against Taran's. We lived, she whispered. Now let's figure out how to do more than that. And together, under a sky that had tried to kill them more times than they could count, they began again. The war ended not with a final blow, but with a silence none dared break. Veron Zet held its breath as the Vextal disappeared from orbit, leaving behind smoldering wreckage and fractured ground, and a people forever changed. In the weeks that followed, the stronghold transformed. Where warriors once sharpened blades, now scholars shared data with human scientists. The council chamber was no longer a tribunal of judgment, but a forum of voices. Taran stood in the center of it all, no longer just a warrior, but a chosen voice. Elder Vorik placed a hand on her shoulder. The clans have agreed. You will represent us to the stars. Taran bowed her head, then glanced across the room. Jon leaned casually against a pillar, arms crossed, lips curved in quiet pride. When she met his gaze, something unspoken passed between them, a thread that had stretched across battles and nights and wounds, and held. Later, as the sun dipped low, casting amber light over the canyon, Jon found her by the training grounds. She was alone, spear in hand, tracing forms into the air. Slow, precise, like dance. He watched until she paused. You never rest, do you? He said, approaching. Taran smiled faintly. Rest is for those who are finished. He stepped beside her. And are you? She lowered her weapon. I thought I'd die in this war. I didn't plan for after. Jon nodded. Neither did I. They stood in silence, the wind warm against their skin. Then she spoke. The council offered you passage home. I know. Will you take it? He looked at her. Do you want me to? Taran's jaw clenched. It's not about want. You don't belong here, Jon. This world, it cuts deep. He reached for her hand, fingers brushing against hers. So do you? And yet I stayed. Her eyes searched his. Why? Because I don't want to just survive anymore. I want to build something. With you. For a heartbeat. She said nothing. Then, the stronghold has need of an ambassador shield-bearer. Someone who understands both our ways. His grin spread. Is that an official offer? She leaned in, her voice low. It's an invitation. To stay. To belong. Jon pulled her into a kiss. Not born of desperation this time, but of quiet certainty. A promise exchanged under fading sunlight. Mia and Carter left 2 days later, bound for Earth on a diplomatic vessel escorted through neutral space. They stood by the landing pad as Jon said his goodbyes. You sure about this? Mia asked, arms crossed. Jon nodded. Someone has to be the bridge. Carter gave a rare smile. Try not to get stabbed again. Makes for terrible reports. Jon laughed. No promises. As the ship lifted, Taran stepped beside him. Do you regret it? She asked. He watched the vessel vanish into the clouds. Not even a little. Months passed. The scars of war healed slowly, but the roots of peace grew fast. Taran, clad now in robes of deep red and silver, stood before a crowd of both Zera and human dignitaries in the central forum. She spoke of unity, of survival, of the day her brother fell, and the day she rose not in revenge, but in resolve. And Jon stood beside her, not as a guest, not as a prisoner, but as her equal, as her choice. One night, as they lay beneath the open sky on the stronghold's highest terrace, Jon traced the constellations with his finger. I used to think stars were just places to go, he murmured. Taran's voice was soft. And now I think they're reminders that light still reaches even the harshest places. She curled against him. We are light, then. He kissed the top of her head. No, we're the ones who survive the darkness. And Veronzet, harsh and wild, held them in her crimson silence. But for the first time, the future was not a battlefield. It was something they would shape together.